Today I'll be talking about my composition, Peace of Quiet. So before I begin getting into the composition and where it came from, I am very grateful to Messiah University for my sabbatical leave to be able to spend time on this piece. I've been working so long teaching, including summers and sometimes during breaks, fall break, spring break, that it leaves little time to actually sit and think as a composer. Instead, you're always trying to jot something down, remember this later, work on it at 2 o'clock in the morning when you have time and you're not in a rehearsal, or other things in life that are going on that just interfere. So I'm grateful for this time. Began working on the piece a year ago in March and finished it on March 20th. That was double bar day, and was pretty excited about that. And I wouldn't have been able to do that without a sabbatical leave, with so many other things that cause my attention to go from place to place between conductor and composer and teacher of conducting and Winlet. So I'm very grateful that I had that opportunity. Where did this piece come from? I'll give you the background of the piece, then I'll explain what happens in each section and why I'm doing this video in the first place. The piece came from a day when I was driving to my job to conduct. I was driving down the highway and I heard the tragedy that happened in Newton, Connecticut. Our elementary students were gunned down and 4 teachers. When I heard that, I pulled off to the side of the road and I listened to the article in the news and then the reoccurring articles all through the day about how many dead and what had happened. And it just struck me as something that at this point shouldn't have been happening. The first time I became aware of this type of tragedy, and most of us in the United States, or across the world for that matter, was with the Columbine massacre in Littleton, Colorado, back in 1999. At that time when that happened, I remember thinking how awful that this is happening, that watching students climb out of their cafeteria windows and their gym windows and trying to hide and escape while we were trying to find a way to get people to safety, and to see all those students from that high school being marched out to their buses, marched out to their cars, and trying to get them home and safe. I remember seeing that and thinking, what an awful tragedy, and maybe that was a one-time thing. Now, of course, at the time, I didn't really have that much of an internet, so I didn't know about anything else that had happened in other places, but since it was on CNN and any other news source, it was broadcast all day. That affected me very, very deeply. Then when this incident happened with Sandy Hook, all I could think was, wow, these things have been happening, and they've been happening before 1999, but let's call 1999 the most aware beginning to the tragedy of a school shooting. And I remember sitting on this side of the road just weeping that those parents had Christmas gifts under their trees for their students. And those elementary students who may or may not have believed in Santa Claus, may not have been Christian, Christmas is still something special. In 10 days, they're not going to be able to give their child that Christmas gift. And that child's not going to be able to open that Christmas gift. That bedroom will forever remain silent. And that struck me, because my children at the time were about the same age. My son Anthony, my daughter, was a little older at the time. And no child should go to school fearing for their lives, plain and simple. And unfortunately, we are in a country where this has become normal, and it has become something to be controversial. We have to make it political, we have to make it about gun violence, we have to make it about mental health, but really do nothing about it. Instead, talk about it. But it's not really pushing the needle in the direction it should be, because there have been many more school violent incidents that have happened, including Robb Elementary. And again, I see Robb Elementary and I, again, come back to the same question. Why is this a choice? Why would someone choose to do this? Why would someone try to take innocence or take the lives of someone just for fun? Because if you know anything about that shooting and you've read what happened there, it's disgusting. And those parents and those grandparents and that community wept. And our politicians and our religious figures stood up and said, we've got to do something about this. Parkland happens. Was something done? And then the needle moves again and again and again, further away from solving the issue and more about accepting it. So obviously I have a very strong stance on this, and I feel very deeply for the people who lost the children, not just the experience the children had in those moments, but the fact that there are parents and grandparents and brothers and sisters, community members, members of churches, members of organizations who will never have the experience of those children growing up to be something important and different in the world. My son, at one point, when he was very young, I'm going to say he was about 11 years old, was sitting in the back seat of my car, and I was playing lots of loud music because I like loud music. Obviously, it was for me, it's not going to necessarily be rock and roll loud at the time, but it was going to be things like, I don't know, band music that's very loud. Very much enjoyed those type of things. And I was playing that in my car, and I remember one time one of my pieces was being played, and I turned to him, being, the dad, and said, "What do you think of that? That's something I wrote." And his reply at 11 years old was, "Dad, have you ever written a piece of quiet?" And that really struck me. And right then I said, now I have a title, and I want to see what I can do with this title. That was 15 years ago. And I kept thinking, how am I going to do this? What's going to happen here? How am I going to make this work? And then when I started seeing all the continuous mass shootings at schools and at churches and at concerts and all these venues, it just finally hit me. Peace and quiet is what we need. We need a collective prayer. We need a way to find ourselves in a moment of peace so that we're not allowing violence to be the thing that is the answer. Now, if you're familiar with my Pursuit of Happiness Symphony, you may know that I've been talking about this in a different way, where I blame social media, I blame computers, and I still blame all of those things, because when our students don't have the ability to be a part of a community, such as a band or a chorus, even a football team, basketball team, a little different when it comes to athletics, but they don't have that opportunity to be a part of a community. When something happens or they're pushed out of that community, if their response is, I'm going to pick up a gun and shoot people, it's just amazingly difficult for me to comprehend. So in this piece, what I decided to do is I was going to write a piece of music that allows us to reflect. Now, I've spoken with conductors, I've emailed conductors, I've had the typical 100% no reply from conductors because of the topic of the piece. It's a heavy lift. But I assure you, as the composer of this piece, that this does not depict violence. It's not one of those pieces that's going to portray a gunman walking into a school. Instead, this piece is a celebration and remembrance of those children's lives. And the first movement, the prelude is called Peace Unto the World. And in that movement, I use Sanskrit and I use Hindi style music. Now, I can't ever say that it's Hindi music in an authentic way, because in all of my research and finding Hindi music, it's kind of difficult to figure out what constitutes a prayer and what constitutes raga as a prayer. And that's just not my area. So I continue to research that. And I'm someone who meditates every single day, twice a day if I can, to put myself in a place of peace and understanding and control of my own thoughts and my own actions. So I found this beautiful prayer. It's a 4-part prayer of peace: peace unto the world, peace unto myself, blessings for greatness, and blessings for all. And basically that's the chant that is going to happen in this piece. It does at some point use a Tibetan bowl, which I really love. Conductors can substitute a chime, although I'd rather not that be the case. But it is a prayer of peace. It's a moment where it takes us back, and you'll hear more of a music box type of sound where we're recalling what happened way back in 1999. The text is by Marge Tyndale. She's a poet that I had discovered just in research that she wrote this beautiful poem called Crying for Columbine. She's no longer with us, but the poem is the structure of the piece. And it's asking the question, did the souls escape Columbine and flow right to heaven? How did the angels come and take them? How did they enter the kingdom of God? Whether it is Christian God, Hindu God, it doesn't matter. How did they enter? What took them there? And the beauty of that expression, and where the rest of us are still crying for Columbine because we continue to see the tragedy happen. The third section, and again, I don't call them movements because they're not really related like a traditional symphony, but the third section is a grandparent's lament. And I decided really early on that the grandparents would be depicted by bass clarinet and tuba. I love writing for tuba. I think it's a beautiful instrument. Bass clarinet is equally as impressive as an instrument. The range, the sound, the timbre has always appealed to me. So there are cadenzas by the bass clarinet, and then there is this melody that is a dialogue in duet between bass clarinet and tuba. It's filled with anguish on purpose. It's filled with questions on purpose, because we always talk about the child, the parent, but we're not thinking about the generations that affects backwards and the generations that could have affected moving forward if the child were still with us. So the grandparents' lament is exactly what you would think it is. It is a lament. It transitions directly into the next section. It is written for the students of Robb Elementary, and it's called Blessed is the Fruit. Now, I know that's a strange title, but as I said in my preview video that I just posted, that not many people that I know of have set the Catholic prayer, the Hail Mary, into music, besides it being chant or chant adjacent. And I decided I was going to try to do that, but have a double meaning. So in the Hail Mary, the question is, in that prayer, it's stated, "Blessed is the fruit of thy womb," to Mary, Jesus, the baby Jesus. And the question that the mothers are asking is, "Blessed is the fruit of my womb?" And you can fill in any of those children's names. The framing of that movement uses Ya Llorona, which is a Mexican folk song that is this beautiful song about a woman searching for her children who have passed on. Right? There's so many things that are calling back to the families and the history of the families and the culture. All of those things are within this song. So I set that as the frame for this movement, being that Robb Elementary School is in Uvalde, Texas. Most of those people, most of those students are speaking Spanish. So I wanted to use something that was as authentic as I could. And I'm very aware of all the different settings of that song in particular, and it just appealed to me greatly. So that's the framing of that movement. And throughout the entire piece, we have this heartbeat that from the very first part of the movement one to this part of this section, we have a heartbeat that just keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. And as it repeats, it starts to push us into the next section, which is the first time that I actually express my anguish and rage. So writing this piece, I had to look at these faces, the faces of all these children. I had to watch so many different newscasts where parents are speaking. I had to witness people claiming that these things were all fake and all put on and not real, which is just another American epidemic problem, right? Where we look at things and we say everything is fake because there's no reasoning and there's no thought. And we just take for granted what's on the internet as being true, and we listen to these people spout off whatever they want to spout off, and half the nation goes with it, half the nation goes against it. And my anguish and rage definitely shows in the next section of the piece. And with anguish and rage, this movement is me crying out in anguish and rage because it continues to happen. So when I got very serious about setting this down, putting this into music, right at the moment that I started to pen the very first note, there was a shooting at a Catholic school in Minneapolis of rage, anger, questioning. That's what that movement is about. When that movement comes to its end with its incredibly loud scream, it resolves into a drum roll that takes us into the final choral section of the piece, written for Sandy Hook Elementary, called When I Grow Up. Now, When I Grow Up, the lyrics for When I Grow Up came from Mariam Aziz. When the Parkland shooting happened, Mariam penned this beautiful poem, and it was published in the Boston Globe and other places, and you can find her online speaking the poem. I managed to get in touch with her and said, "I love your words, may I use them?" And her response came a couple days later, and she said, "Absolutely, all you have to do is credit my name in the score." So using her lyrics in combination with some of mine to create When I Grow Up. And it questions everybody, like, when I grow up as a child, I wanted to be something. But because I died in a school shooting, I don't have the opportunity to become. That is a very, very, very strong message. In elementary methods, years and years ago, Shirley Halls at Seton Hill University taught us how to do roll call musically by singing falling minor third. So for instance, you would say, "Jim," and then the child responds, "I am here." "Beth, I am here." So in this piece, I establish a roll call of the living where the choir calls and responses with living people in my life. I include some of my own students' names in there on purpose. Then we get this sing-song back and forth, the name, and I am here. Then Mariam Aziz's poem comes in and takes us to a different place. And the next time the violins sustain, we begin a roll call of those lost. And instead of it being the name and I am here, it's name after name after name, 22 names in a row. And as I was writing it, my frustration and my soul was tearing apart. So those note values get slower and broader as each name is sung. When we get to the final sustain in the violin, the 4 adults at Sandy Hook Elementary's names are spoken or whispered by the choir, with each one syllabically slowing. This is a movement that does not resolve. It still questions, why is this happening? The final movement, a movement of hope, at least I hope that it is the idea of this ascension at first light, where the souls that we heard in Columbine, the children we experience in Robb Elementary in the piece, and then finally the Sandy Hook students' souls are rising into heaven. And those souls are rising to God, to the universe, to whatever people want to call it, and whatever entity people worship or follow. And it's supposed to give us a sense of hope. And it rises, and it's basically this idea of a very slow sunrise. And it fades, and it leaves the piece with a question mark. And in every single moment, in every single movement, there is a place where the music will crescendo to nothing. And crescendo again to silence. Crescendo again to silence. Those are the moments, they're the most touching moments in the piece, and those are the opportunities for us to reflect.